My uncle emptied our family trust, left my mom struggling, and told me to pick a cheaper college when I said I might have to drop out. When I confronted him, he smirked and said, "Not my fault you chose champagne dreams on a beer budget." I just stared at him. That was 2 years ago. This morning, he was standing outside my car, screaming that I destroyed 3 generations. My greedy uncle emptied our family trust and left my mom struggling, so I made sure he lost his house. When my grandfather passed away, he left behind a family trust. It wasn't millions, but it was enough to make life a little easier for everyone. My mom, her brother, my uncle, and me, since my dad had passed away when I was 12. The trust was meant for shared family emergencies, education, and keeping my grandfather's old house in the family. My uncle Mark was the trustee. He was always the charming type, a smooth talker, funny at family gatherings, and always had some new business idea. But even as a kid, I noticed things never quite added up with him. He'd borrow tools and never return them, promise to pay someone back and suddenly forget, or tell 2 completely different stories to different people and then act offended if anyone pointed it out. About 2 years after Grandpa's death, my mom asked Mark for some trust funds to help with my college tuition. The trust had more than enough for that. Grandpa had specifically mentioned my education in his will. Mark told her, "Oh, the market's been bad. The funds are tied up right now. I can maybe get you something next year." He said it with this patronizing little smile, like we were just naive for not understanding how investments work. I didn't buy it. My grandfather's lawyer had explained that the trust money wasn't in some risky stock portfolio. It was in a safe account. Fast forward a few months. I'm home from college and my mom is stressed about bills. I offered to look through the trust statements. Mark had accidentally left a box of papers in my mom's garage. Inside were statements showing huge withdrawals over the past year, tens of thousands at a time, labeled personal loan or investment. The worst part? The account was empty, completely drained. When I confronted Mark, he rolled his eyes and said, "Relax, I'm just moving the money into a higher yield account. You don't understand finances." When I pressed him, he snapped and said, "Do you really want to accuse family of stealing after everything I've done for you? Done for me?" The man never even gave me a birthday card without asking for gas money to cover the trip. Over the next few weeks, Mark kept acting like nothing happened. He'd show up to family dinners bragging about his renovation projects and business trips. Meanwhile, my mom was on the verge of losing her house because she'd counted on that trust money for emergencies. One night at dinner, I mentioned I might have to take a semester off from school to work more hours. Mark smirked and said, "Well, maybe you should have picked a cheaper college. Not my fault you chose champagne dreams on a beer budget." I wanted to throw my plate at him. A friend of mine works at the county records office, and she found that Mark had recently bought a vacation cabin in cash. He'd also taken out a massive home equity loan against his own house. On top of that, he was late on his property taxes. That's when it clicked. He hadn't invested the trust money. He'd blown through it trying to look rich, and now he was running out of options. I spoke to Grandpa's old lawyer, who was furious when he saw the statements. He explained that what Mark had done wasn't just bad money management, it was theft and breach of fiduciary duty. We filed a petition in probate court to have him removed as trustee and force him to repay the funds. Mark acted shocked, calling my mom crying, saying, "How could you let her do this to me? This is going to ruin me." When that didn't work, he switched to threats. "You'll regret this." In court, Mark tried to spin the sob story about how he temporarily borrowed the funds because he was going through a rough patch and always intended to pay it back. He even had the audacity to blame me for creating drama and making it impossible for him to rebuild the trust. But the bank statements didn't lie, neither did the deed records for his cabin. The judge ruled in our favor, ordered him to repay the entire amount with interest, and put a lien on his house. Mark didn't have the money. The lien stacked up. His missed property taxes turned into penalties. Within months, the bank foreclosed on his house. When the notice went up, I won't lie, I felt a wave of satisfaction. He'd stolen our safety net, lied to our faces, and tried to make me out to be some ungrateful brat. Now he was the one packing boxes. I didn't gloat to his face. I didn't have to. Watching the moving truck pull away from his driveway was enough. The trust is now managed by an independent trustee. My mom was able to save her house. I finished college without having to drop out. Mark moved to a smaller place in another town. Occasionally, he'll send a passive-aggressive text like, "Hope you're happy, you destroyed the family." About a week after Mark moved, my mom told me she'd called him. Then she said, with a strange look on her face, "He wants to meet, and you should hear what he has to say." Something about the IRS investigating Grandpa's old construction business for tax fraud going back 20 years. My stomach dropped as Mom explained how Mark claimed he'd found records in Grandpa's files showing unreported income from government contracts back in the 80s and 90s. She said Mark was threatening to turn everything over to the feds unless we dropped the lawsuit and let him keep what was left of his assets. I grabbed the kitchen counter to steady myself, while Mom showed me photocopies Mark had sent her of old invoices and handwritten ledgers with numbers that didn't match official tax filings. The dates went back to when I was a toddler and showed payments from city contracts that were never declared. Mom's hands shook as she pointed to Grandpa's signature on document after document. We spent the next 3 days going through every box in Mom's attic looking for anything that might explain or contradict what Mark had found. Attorney Fitzgerald came over on the 4th day and went pale when he saw the evidence. He said this could trigger a full audit of the estate and potentially make us liable for back taxes plus penalties that could reach into 6 figures. 2 weeks later, the IRS sent their first letter requesting all financial records related to Grandpa's business from 1985 to 2005. Mom had to hire a tax attorney named Sandra Williams, who charged $300 an hour just to review the documents. A month into the investigation, I found Mom at 2 in the morning crying over old photo albums spread across the dining room table. She kept touching pictures of family gatherings at Mark's house and whispered that every happy memory felt tainted, now knowing it was all paid for with dirty money. The next morning, Derek messaged me on Instagram saying his dad was losing it and staying up all night going through papers while talking to himself. He said his mom wouldn't let him stay at Mark's apartment anymore because she was scared of how unstable he'd become. I screenshot the messages and forwarded them to Fitzgerald, who said it showed Mark was spiraling but wouldn't help our legal position. That weekend, we had dinner at Aunt Jennifer's house, and nobody mentioned Grandpa or Mark, even though their absence hung over every conversation. The silence felt heavier than any argument would have been. Jennifer kept steering topics away from anything family related, while her husband kept checking his phone nervously. 3 days later, Fitzgerald called in a panic saying Mark had filed a countersuit claiming the entire trust should be invalidated since it was funded with illegal money. He said Mark was trying to burn everything down because he got caught and this could trigger forensic accounting of every asset Grandpa ever owned. The IRS responded by assigning a forensic accountant who demanded 15 years of additional records. Mom had to take a week off work to gather documents from safety deposit boxes and storage units we didn't even know existed. We found receipts and contracts stuffed in shoeboxes in the back of Grandpa's old workshop. Some were water damaged and barely readable, but the accountant wanted everything. 6 weeks into the investigation, Mom was surviving on coffee and anxiety medication. I ran into Carol at the grocery store and she looked exhausted. She told me Mark called her at all hours ranting about injustice and how he destroyed his life. She said she was sorry about the trust money, but Mark had been making bad choices for years, and this was just the latest disaster. During Mark's deposition the following week, he pulled out a cassette tape and played a recording of Grandpa from 15 years ago, talking to someone about arrangements with a contractor. Mom went white hearing Grandpa's voice casually mentioning kickbacks and bid rigging like he was discussing the weather. Fitzgerald had to call a recess when Mom started hyperventilating. The forensic accountant subpoenaed 20 more boxes of records after hearing the tape. 2 months into the investigation, Mom and I spent entire weekends in her garage sorting through financial documents. We worked mostly in silence, except when we'd find something innocent like an old birthday card or my kindergarten report card tucked between invoices. Those moments felt like finding clean spots in a contaminated house. Sandra Williams finally called with an update saying the IRS would settle for $47,000 in back taxes and penalties. She said it was better than the $150,000 they could have demanded, but Mom and I both knew it would wipe out her emergency savings and part of her retirement. Mom just nodded and signed the settlement papers without saying anything. That night around 11, we heard pounding on the front door and Mark screaming that we'd ruined his life over money that was dirty anyway. I could smell the alcohol from inside the house as he kept slamming his fist against the door. Mom ran upstairs while I called 911 and watched through the peephole as Mark stumbled around the porch knocking over her flower pots. The police arrived within 10 minutes and arrested him for public intoxication and and violating the no-contact order Fitzgerald had gotten after the threatening texts. They had to practically carry him to the patrol car while he kept shouting about how we were all going to pay. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Derek asking if his dad was really in jail because his mom wouldn't tell him anything. I drove to the coffee shop near campus where Derek was already waiting in a corner booth looking tired and confused. He had dark circles under his eyes and kept turning his phone over and over in his hands while I explained what happened with the drunk porch incident. Derek stared at his coffee for a long time before saying quietly that his dad brought this on himself, but he was still his dad. 3 days later, Carol called while I was studying and told me Mark had been hiding stuff in a storage unit filled with valuable collectibles he bought with the trust money. She said she'd found old receipts in their garage and would testify if it helped my mom recover something from all this mess. I thanked her and immediately called Fitzgerald, who got excited and said this could change everything if we could prove Mark used stolen funds for those purchases. That afternoon, I went to my first therapy appointment because the anger I felt toward both Grandpa for trusting Mark and Mark for being such a snake was eating me alive. The therapist was this older woman who listened while I ranted for 20 minutes, then suggested I write letters to both of them that I'd never send just to get the feelings out. I thought it sounded stupid, but agreed to try it anyway since nothing else was helping me sleep at night. Fitzgerald filed an emergency motion the next day to freeze all of Mark's remaining assets based on Carol's information about the storage unit. The judge granted it immediately, and Mark's lawyer requested an emergency hearing claiming his client was being persecuted by a vindictive family member. A week later, Rachel met me at the storage facility with printouts she'd found showing payments going back 18 months, all made with cash withdrawals. She pointed out the dates matched up with trust fund withdrawals and said Mark had been planning this for a while, not just having a rough patch. Mom broke down during our meeting with Sandra Brown about the tax situation when Sandra explained the payment plan options and timelines. She kept saying she was going to lose the house paying these taxes, and Sandra had to calm her down by showing her how the numbers could work. I noticed I'd lost 12 pounds since this whole thing started when my roommate commented that I looked like crap and asked if I was sick. I hadn't slept through a full night in weeks and kept waking up at 3 in the morning thinking about court dates and legal fees. The storage unit got opened by court order, revealing $30,000 worth of rare coins and vintage guitars, all carefully cataloged and stored. Fitzgerald immediately filed to have them liquidated to partially satisfy the judgment against Mark and scheduled another hearing to discuss the assets. During that hearing, Mark completely lost it in court, yelling that everyone was conspiring against him and this was all a setup to steal his property. Judge Brennan slammed his gavel and threatened Mark with contempt charges while Mark's own lawyer asked for a recess to calm his client down. 3 months into the investigation, Derek needed help with his college applications since Mark was obviously unavailable and Carol was overwhelmed with everything. I spent a Saturday afternoon helping him with essays, and when he thanked me saying I didn't have to do this, I told him we were still family and meant it. The IRS letter came 2 weeks later while Mom was at work, and I was home on break. The envelope looked official enough to make my stomach drop before I even opened it. They'd finished their investigation and were offering a settlement of $47,000. Take it or leave it, with payment due in 60 days. Mom's hands shook when she signed the papers that night, and I watched her open her laptop right after to search for weekend cashier jobs and night shift positions at the hospital where she worked days. The next morning, we drove to the courthouse for Mark's countersuit hearing, and his lawyer actually tried to argue that since the money came from illegal sources, Mark shouldn't have to pay it back. Judge Brennan's face turned red as he said the illegal source of funds doesn't excuse breach of fiduciary duty, then dismissed the case with prejudice, which meant Mark could never file this claim again. Mark slammed his chair back so hard it fell over, and his lawyer had to grab his arm to stop him from saying something that would get him arrested for contempt. 2 weeks after that disaster, Mom surprised me by signing us up for a grief counseling group at the community center. She told the group she was mourning someone who never really existed, her brother who she thought cared about family, and half the people there nodded like they understood exactly what she meant. The storage unit auction happened the following week, and after the auctioneer's fees and transport costs, we got $28,000 that went straight toward the judgment debt. Fitzgerald started the paperwork to garnish Mark's future wages since he still owed over $100,000. Carol called me that same night, crying and apologizing for not warning us about Mark sooner. She said she'd been scared of him, not physically violent but vindictive in ways that could destroy your life, and she was sorry we got caught in his chaos. 4 months into this whole mess, Mark filed for bankruptcy, thinking he could wipe out the judgment debt and start fresh. Fitzgerald immediately filed an objection, explaining to the bankruptcy court that debts from breach of fiduciary duty can't be discharged under federal law. I went back to college for spring semester, trying to focus on my economics classes while handling phone calls from lawyers and court clerks. My professor noticed I was struggling and offered extra office hours to help me catch up on what I'd missed during all the court dates. Derek called me one afternoon to say Mark had been calling him nonstop, trying to turn him against us, saying we were destroying him out of spite. Derek told me he wasn't stupid and could see what his dad had done to everyone. The worst part came when Mom decided to put Grandpa's house on the market to pay the IRS debt. Standing in that empty living room where we'd had 30 years of Christmas dinners and birthday parties, she said maybe it was better to let it all go and start fresh somewhere without all these memories. The bankruptcy hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and when the judge ruled that Mark's debt from the trust theft couldn't be discharged, Mark's face went completely gray. The judge explained that breach of fiduciary duty was too serious to just wipe away in bankruptcy, and Mark would carry this debt for the rest of his life. 5 months passed before we got an offer on Grandpa's house. The buyer wanted it for $20,000 less than asking price, but it was enough to cover the IRS debt, so Mom signed the papers that same afternoon. I drove over the next weekend to help her pack up the place and found Grandpa's old journal tucked behind some books in his study. The entries from when the kickback started made my stomach hurt because he'd written things like needing the money for our college funds and asking himself what he was becoming. Mom came in while I was reading and just took the journal from my hands and put it in the donation box without saying a word. Rachel called me that week to tell me Mark had gotten a job at a used car dealership downtown, and Fitzgerald had already filed the paperwork for wage garnishment, so 25% of every paycheck would go toward the judgment. I was leaving the grocery store 3 days later when Mark appeared next to my car and started yelling about how I destroyed 3 generations of our family. His face was red and spit was flying as he kept going on about how I should be proud of myself while I fumbled with my keys and got in the car and locked the doors. He kept pounding on the window until I backed out and drove away with him still shouting in the parking lot. Derek texted me a week later with news that he'd gotten into Ohio State with a partial scholarship and asked if I could write him a recommendation letter for a summer program. I wrote it that night and made sure not to mention anything about his dad's situation and just focused on Derek's grades and volunteer work. He texted back a simple thank you for still believing in him, which made me tear up a little. Mom's apartment closing happened the next month, and I helped her move into a smaller place near downtown that actually had better light than the old house. She arranged all the family photos on a bookshelf, but I noticed none of them had Grandpa in them anymore. Rachel stopped by my dorm room that evening to warn me that Mark had been calling around asking people about my class schedule and where I worked my part-time job. Campus security set me up with an escort service for my evening classes after I showed them the restraining order paperwork. Mom broke down crying 2 nights later when we were having dinner at her new place and started talking about how Dad would have handled everything so much better. She kept saying he always knew how to deal with family problems without destroying everyone, and I just held her while she cried and wished I had even half of his wisdom. The next week, Mark sent letters to Mom's workplace even though the no-contact order specifically said he couldn't do that. The police arrested him at the car dealership, and this time the judge held him without bail until the hearing. Carol texted me that maybe jail would finally make him stop, but we both knew better than to really believe that. My graduation came 2 weeks after that, and Mom sat in the 3rd row looking proud but tired while they called my name. She hugged me afterward and said that she and Dad had always dreamed of this day, and at least some dreams had survived everything intact. 3 weeks after graduation, the court date for Mark's no-contact violation finally came, and I sat in the back row watching him try to explain to the judge why showing up at the car dealership wasn't really a violation since he was just shopping for a car. The judge didn't buy it, and when she said 90 days in county jail, Mark's face went white, and he turned to look at me with so much hate that the bailiff actually stepped between us while they cuffed him. Mom squeezed my hand as they led him away, but we both knew this wouldn't be the end of it. The family group chat that used to buzz with birthday wishes and funny memes had been dead silent for months until my aunt texted one word about Thanksgiving, but nobody answered, and the message just sat there like a reminder of everything we'd lost. 8 months after everything started, Carol called Mom crying because she needed to file for emergency custody changes since she didn't want Derek visiting his dad in jail. And within an hour, Mark's mother was calling Mom screaming about how we destroyed the family and stolen her son's future. I started my new job at an accounting firm downtown where nobody knew about the trust or the trial. And during orientation, when they talked about ethics training, I kept thinking about how Grandpa's company probably had the same rules that he'd ignored. Mom surprised me by joining a book club and signing up for pottery classes at the community center. And when I asked about it, she said she was building a life that was just hers, not as someone's wife or daughter or victim. Mark got out after serving 60 days for good behavior and immediately filed a harassment complaint against me claiming I'd been stalking him, which got dismissed in 2 days, but still shows up in online court records when you Google my name. 10 months after the original trial, the first garnishment payment showed up in Mom's account for $400 from Mark's wages, and Fitzgerald called to say it would take decades to recover everything, but at least it was a start. Derek graduated high school with honors that spring, and Mark couldn't attend because of the restraining order. So I watched from the back as Carol cheered alone, and Derek kept scanning the crowd with this complicated look on his face. I ran into one of Grandpa's old colleagues at a coffee shop near my office, and he started telling me a story about Grandpa's generosity, but then stopped mid-sentence and asked if I knew about the company issues. And when I nodded, he just said the corruption had been an open secret for years. That same week, Mark posted a 20-minute video on social media calling our family criminals and claiming he was the real victim, which got shared hundreds of times locally, and Mom's phone rang nonstop with upset relatives asking why we made private business public. The worst part was explaining to my cousins why their dad was calling us thieves on Facebook. Mom spent hours on the phone while I deleted comments from people who didn't know the whole story. 3 days later, Mom's sister drove up from Cincinnati and sat us down in the living room. She'd seen the video and wanted to know if we really took Mark's house. I showed her the court documents and the empty trust statements. Her face went pale when she saw the withdrawal amounts. She left without saying goodbye to Mark. The video kept spreading and someone sent it to Mom's boss, who called her into his office the next morning. She came home crying and said he understood but asked her to take a few days off until things calmed down. I reported the video to Facebook, but they said it didn't violate community standards. More relatives called and most believed us once we explained, but a few took Mark's side. Mom's therapy sessions increased to twice a week. 11 months after finding the empty trust, she came home from therapy with a different look on her face. She sat at the kitchen table and talked about Grandpa for the first time without crying. She said people are complicated, and even the ones who hurt us aren't all bad. I nodded, but didn't really believe it yet. The next week, I drove to the cemetery where Dad was buried. I hadn't been there since this whole mess started. The grass was freshly cut and someone had left flowers. I sat by his headstone and told him I tried to protect Mom. I said I hoped I didn't destroy everything in the process. The cemetery was quiet and peaceful and didn't judge me for what I'd done. As the 1-year anniversary of finding the empty trust got closer, Mom and I both cleared our calendars for that day without talking about it. We knew we'd need each other. 2 weeks before the anniversary, my phone rang from an unknown number. The voicemail was from Mark's old business partner saying Mark wanted to tell me the real truth about Grandpa if I helped reduce the garnishment. I forwarded it straight to Fitzgerald and the prosecutor. They filed another violation of the no contact order. On the anniversary day, Mom and I didn't talk about the trust or Mark or any of it. We cooked Dad's favorite lasagna recipe and looked through old photo albums from before everything fell apart. Mom smiled at a picture of all of us at Christmas when I was 8. Mark was in the photo holding baby Derek and actually looked happy. We put the albums away and watched old movies until we both fell asleep on the couch. 3 weeks later, Carol called at 2 in the morning. Mark had been arrested for trying to break into Grandpa's old house. The new owners found him in the backyard with a crowbar trying to pry open the basement window. He told the cops he was looking for family documents, but they found meth in his pocket. Carol's voice was shaking as she said she was filing for sole custody of Derek. The next morning, Derek called me sobbing. His voice cracked when he asked if his dad was going to be okay. I couldn't lie to him. I told him his dad needed help that we couldn't give him. I promised Derek he would be okay and that his mom loved him. He cried harder and hung up. The prosecutor called that afternoon with a plea offer for Mark. 6 months in jail with mandatory mental health treatment or face trial and possibly years in prison. Mark's public defender strongly recommended he take it. At the sentencing hearing 13 months after we discovered the empty trust, Mark stood in his orange jumpsuit and took the plea. But when the judge asked if he had anything to say, Mark launched into a 20-minute rant. He blamed Grandpa for being corrupt and hiding money. He blamed me for destroying the family over money. He blamed the system for not understanding business. The judge's face got redder with each word. When Mark finally stopped, the judge added an extra month for showing no remorse. Mark screamed that we'd all regret this as the bailiffs dragged him out. 2 weeks into his sentence, Mom got a call from the jail's mental health coordinator. They diagnosed Mark with bipolar disorder and started him on medication. The coordinator said Mark was responding well to treatment. Mom hung up and stared at the wall. She said quietly that maybe this was what he needed all along. 3 weeks later, Mark's sister called Mom about hosting a small family dinner. She said she wanted us to try being in the same room again without screaming at each other. Mom hesitated but agreed to go. I drove us there on a Saturday afternoon. The house smelled like pot roast and nobody mentioned Mark or Grandpa or the trust or anything that had happened. We just passed the potatoes and talked about the weather and Derek's upcoming graduation. It felt weird, but at least we weren't throwing things. Derek pulled me aside after dinner to show me his college essay draft. He'd written about family complications and learning what resilience really meant. The part about me made me uncomfortable when he wrote that I'd saved our family from completely falling apart. I told him I wasn't sure that was true, but he just shrugged and said I didn't see myself clearly. Mom started going through Grandpa's remaining stuff the next week. She sold his tool collection to a neighbor who collected vintage equipment. His watch collection went to an antique dealer downtown. She took the cash and opened a new savings account at a different bank. She told me firmly she'd never be caught without resources again. The determination in her voice was something I hadn't heard before. Spring came and I got a card in the mail from Carol. She thanked me for treating Derek like family despite everything with Mark. She wrote that Derek had told her everything I'd done for him, and it meant more than I could know. I kept the card in my desk drawer. At work, my boss called me in for my annual review. She said my attention to detail and ethical standards had impressed everyone. The promotion came with a decent raise and more responsibility reviewing financial reports. The irony wasn't lost on me that Mark's theft had made me paranoid about every financial document I touched. Mom started mentioning someone named Robert from her pottery class. He was a widower who understood complicated grief. She brought him to dinner one Sunday and he seemed nice enough. Mom told me later she wasn't looking to replace anyone but was ready to add new chapters to her life. I was happy to see her smiling again. Derek's graduation came faster than expected. At his going away party before college, he hugged me tight and said I'd shown him that family wasn't about blood or money. He said it was about who shows up when everything falls apart. His mom took pictures of us together and I realized this kid had become important to me. The garnishment checks from Mark's commissary account started arriving monthly. They were tiny amounts that would take decades to add up to anything meaningful. Mom framed the first check stub and hung it in the kitchen. She said it wasn't about the money anymore, but proof that justice existed even if it moved slowly. 9 months into his sentence, Mark's therapist forwarded a letter to Mom. Mark had written about how his mental health issues had contributed to his choices. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it acknowledged what he'd done. He was responding to treatment and making progress. Mom read it twice, then filed it away without comment. Time kept moving, and suddenly it was 18 months since I'd first found those bank statements. Mom called to say she'd rented a storage unit to finally sort through Grandpa's things we'd been avoiding. We spent a Saturday going through boxes of old photos and papers. Most of it went to donation centers. We kept a few pictures from before everything went bad. Standing in that empty storage unit, Mom took my hand. She said simply that we'd survived. Different and scarred, but still standing, and that was enough. We locked the unit and walked to our cars. The trust money was mostly gone forever, and Mark was still in jail, and our family would never be what it was. But Mom was dating again, and Derek was thriving at college, and I had a good job, and we'd learned to protect ourselves. The sun was setting as we drove away from that storage unit. Mom honked her horn as she turned toward her house, and I headed to mine. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek asking about visiting during his winter break. I smiled and texted back that he was always welcome. Some stories don't end with everything fixed and perfect. Sometimes they end with people still standing after the storm has passed. That's what this was. Not a happy ending exactly, but an ending where we'd survived and learned and moved forward. The family trust was gone, but we'd built something else. We'd built boundaries and strength and the knowledge that we could weather whatever came next. And honestly, that felt like enough.